Hello, my name is Susan Palm, and I have the pleasure of supporting our North American clients as they implement their GRC programs today. I am pleased to welcome you to our discussion on the future of risk management. Joining me is a distinguished panel of experts who are at the front lines of the current pandemic. Each of them brings a deep career of service and leadership to today's discussion, and I apologize that time doesn't allow for a full sharing of their credentials. Steve Ferguson currently serves as the Deputy Director of Licensing and Entrepreneurship at the National Institute of Health. Prior to joining the NIH in 1990, Mr. Ferguson served in marketing and management positions in biomedical firms, subsequent to being a scientist at the National Cancer Institute. A chemist by training with a master's in business administration, Mr. Ferguson has been an economic reviewer for the Maryland Industrial Partnerships as well as the Advanced Technology Grant Programs. He is an instructor for the NIH Foundation for Advanced Education in the Sciences Graduate School, where he is also the department chair for the new certificate in technology transfer. Also joining us today is Heather Riley. Heather is a disruptor and change agent with an exceptional and diverse 20-year career in pharmaceuticals, consumer, and medical device industries. She currently serves as the Director of Quality Analytics at Janssen Pharmaceutical Company of Johnson & Johnson. Heather is a masterfully skilled professional in good manufacture private practice, verification and validation, good laboratory practice, computer system validation, HIPAA, Safe Harbor, SOX, ITEL, and ISO 13485. She leads a diverse and collaborative global team in the research and development quality organization. Heather also serves as a board trustee to the Princeton Blaistown Center, where she encourages young women to pursue a STEM career. She also holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry and a Master of Science in Quality Systems Management. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Elizabeth Sullivan, who serves as the Vice President and Chief Risk and Audit Officer at the Washington Metropolitan Transit Area Authority, WMATA. At WMATA, she leads the internal audit function in providing insurance and advisory services, enterprise risk management, and control management over internal control systems. After 18 years of progressive leadership within the financial industry in the area of corporate risk and internal audit, she joined WMATA in 2015 and has spent the last 4 years in the public transit industry. In addition, the external audit liaison issues management and the regulatory compliance oversight functions also report to her. Her office facilitates WMATA's enterprise risk management program, which is designed to enable proactive management of risks to achieve strategic, operational, financial, and compliance objectives. The program is also designed to support the safety risk management component of WMATA's Public Transit Agency plan. In addition to her bachelor's degree in finance, she is also the current chair of the American Public Transportation Association's Committee of Audit Professionals and is committed to the mission to establish and promote standards of performance and conduct for audit organizations within the transit industry. Welcome, panelists. Now let's get started. Each of you is in a unique position at the front line of this pandemic. What lessons have you learned over the past 3 months? Elizabeth, let's start with you.
Well, Susan, as we think about this current simultaneous global shutdown of the economy, of commerce, and the way of life as we know it, there certainly are a lot of lessons learned over the last 3 years. And in general terms, we could think about how we can do things differently with our disaster recovery plans as well as our business resumption plans. We can also consider how we could handle supply chain disruption better. Obviously, a lot of us have experienced some disruption given what's happened recently. But in more specific terms, especially for us as risk management professionals, one lessons learned that I could think about is how we could reconsider how we may have a tendency sometimes to underestimate your quote unquote low probability, high impact risks. I know that a lot of organizations may have assessed the possibility of a pandemic risk, for example, but may have assessed it in a way that puts it in that group. Given how we assess severity using generally these two-factor consideration for severe assessment of risk severity, impact, and probability. I wonder if looking back and seeing the things such as the velocity of this risk, along with the duration, some of which we're still estimating. I wonder how we would consider risks such as this 3 months ago with the information we have
Mm-hmm.
now. So certainly, the coastal framework, the coastal ERM framework, gives us guidance in terms of what it refers to as the prioritization criteria to think about things such as complexity, adaptability, as well as velocity and persistence or duration as we put another lens on risk severity. So for me, I think lessons learned is if we're traditionally considered those two-factor consideration for severity, we want to take a moment back and understand that this art and this science that we so proudly love should help us think through other judgments, considering other
Mm-hmm.
factors beyond those two factors.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Heather, in your role in the pharmaceutical industry, what are you observing or what lessons have you learned in the last 3 months?
Oh, thanks, Susan. I think just building on a little bit of that is that business continuity and making sure that we did the testing of that, right? Making sure that we continue our businesses as we can. But I think also another parameter that's on top of that is maybe you couldn't continue your business, and how can you pivot to help in another perspective that you maybe never even considered. So, and playing out that risk for either converting your manufacturing lines to do things differently, um, anything like that to sort of help with the pandemic when you can. But I think maybe we didn't all realize that business continuity testing was vital and critical, having played out all those risks. And, that's definitely something we need to make sure we focus on. And again, focusing on pivoting if we can to help the greater good for the global pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Steve, the NIH has certainly been in the spotlight, and I think I don't even need to use the full descriptor anymore. Everyone knows who the NIH is, and you've done a lot already, but what additional learnings and partnerships are you thinking about as you plan out the duration of this?
So thank you, Susan. So I think in what we've really learned from this recent experience is that you can't really underestimate the need for to have um, broad partnerships, global partnerships, and really be focused on innovating and innovating quickly. I think the pace of science has always been quick, but I think even the current situation has showed that it's even faster than perhaps we even thought it could be in terms of the need to respond. And so some of the newer techniques that have been developed through public funding of research and collaborations with industries have enabled us to respond very quickly, but there's still a time lag. There's still a difficulty in taking things from the bench to the bedside, and that's certainly a focus of NIH with its basic research programs and also its clinical research programs to be able to do that. And to get that done, we really have to emphasize the partnerships we have, both with our suppliers, our partners, our collaborators, and that can be in industry, that can be in academia, and it's not just in the United States. It really needs to be on a global focus because pandemics like this really have um, global impact, and we really need to work together with partners, health agencies, and governments and companies throughout the world to really be effective in doing this.
Mm-hmm. And Heather, I know partnerships are very common with Janssen Pharmaceutical and certainly J&J. How has this evolved in the last few months for your organization?
Yeah, I can say that we've always partnered and found a way to inspire small innovations, right? However, this has really allowed us to capitalize on that approach and be able to take our big company and help small places in becoming even better, right? So providing them funding or providing them an area in which they can start to try out their certain things. So whether it's a vaccine or whether it's more investigation into something else. So, Johnson and Johnson being a little bit like a cruise ship where it can't be that nimble and that quick. But however, we can support those groups and places that can be that nimble and quick and can be agile to pivot very quickly and to help partner with other groups to make things happen across the entire world. So it's really allowed us to be able to do that and lean into that model that we had already set up, but it's become critical now for us to definitely focus there.
Models that you are all discussing requires an interconnectedness of people to address this interconnectedness of risk. This infers that we need diverse teams to thrive at times like these. How are you thinking about people risk, Heather?
Yeah, so people risk is definitely something that we all need to start to really focus on too for succession planning for critical roles, as well as making sure that we definitely do have diverse teams. This is when you'll start to see that the disruptors and the innovators will start to be turned to and listened to maybe more than they ever were before. And maybe different ideas won't be naysayed or said that's crazy. I think they'll basically lean in more now to answer and listen to what they have to say. And partnerships are critical, right? So those soft skills are becoming very critical for people to be able to work across different industries, different cultures, different time zones, anything of those natures. So our soft skills are really going to play a critical role for us as well, and as we move forward professionally and as well as personally.
Elizabeth, how are you thinking about people risk? Being in the transportation industry, I'm sure it's expanded significantly as your business operates in high proximity between your consumers and your staff.
Right. And just like Heather said, as I think about people risk, I think for us, we know that regardless of what organization or what industry we operate in, people are key to the success of any organization. So as we think about people risk, during the current crisis phase or as we approach some sense of stabilization, we need to consider what our employees expect from us in terms of communications. That's something that I thought was very important in addressing people risk. What do they need to know and what do they need to be assured of during the current state? How much information are we sharing and making available to our employees? And then, of course, as we start to think about some sense of a recovery plan in terms of people, for me, I also wonder, are organizations thinking through right now what employees expect to hear? And are we making it clear to them that our recovery plans are people centric? Are we making it clear that as we approach recovery, at the center of that is consideration for the health and safety of our people? So, in terms of people risk, I'm thinking about it in its current state, the current crisis, as well as some sense of managed reentry.
And as a chief risk officer, what role do you have to play in managing this people risk?
So, just managing people risk in general, or maybe even managing risk in general. I know that CROs have different roles that they play in different organizations. We do what we do best as CROs. We play that role of the facilitator or the enabler to ensure risk-informed decisions. So, depending on the structures of our organizations, our responsibility, accountability, or even participation in the management of risk would be different. So in my world, because I have a dual role, as the chief audit executive as well as the chief risk officer. On the risk side, I play more of a facilitator role. So I certainly know that most that our CROs are thinking in terms of how they enable the organization for success in terms of managing the portfolio of risks that the organization is presented with, especially now. So one of the things that I've been thinking through for me, and of course talking with some of my colleagues, is how do we start the process now to ensure that we are what we call a special focus risk assessment. It has been what we've been looking through and discussing, helping the organization navigate through the new sets of risks that are presented given the current environment. We all know that we're selecting alternate strategies, making changes to our business processes, making changes to how we meet our current goals and how we create value for the organization or continue to sustain value. There's been a lot of changes, whether it's through 100% workforce working remotely, or all these stay-at-home orders, social distancing measures for us with our ridership and ensuring safety of our customers as well as our employee population. We're doing various things in response to that. The question is, as CROs, are we making our organization think through the new risks that are presented to the organization as these alternate processes are selected, as they're determined to be the right course? Are we also considering risk every step of the way? I certainly think that we should start engaging everyone, right? Engage everyone in the discussion around through education. I think that's the role of a CRO, that's the role of a facilitator. Let's educate people in terms of the risks that we're faced with right now. We're talking about cybersecurity risks. Most of our employees are working outside of our normal firewalls. So are we educating them to address that concern? Or as we think about fraud risk, because in a crisis situation, right, you expect frauds to go on the uptick, right? I think the ACFE has said publicly that the current coronavirus pandemic is the perfect storm for fraud.
Right.
So
yes, and I think you bring up a great point, Elizabeth. And I think we're going to pivot to the next question on data risk and privacy, because I think a lot of the risks that Elizabeth mentioned, are kind of front and center. So I'm wondering, how do you plan, all of you, to think about or address employee privacy in the new normal, where digital IDs and coronavirus immunity cards may become, part of our future, certainly as we start thinking about bringing people back into offices. But I think, Steve, I'd like to ask you to answer this first. There is a tremendous transfer of bioprocesses that are common in your space, complex, numerous challenges, the risk of data privacy with some of these large data sets, intellectual property, the list goes on. Steve, give us your thoughts with regard to data privacy and data risk. Thank you. Steve, over to you. Oh, Steve, we can't. Stephen, you're muted. Could you unmute yourself, please? Yep. So while we're waiting for Steve to refresh his screen, I wanted to ask Elizabeth about your thoughts here on reporting and HIPAA and any enhancements. If you could quickly just share a few thoughts, and then we'll go right back to you, Stephen.
Okay.
So just privacy obviously is important as we collect data. We need to respect the privacy of the persons that make this information available to us. So you mentioned HIPAA. I think a lot of organizations have to comply with that. So I probably would defer to Stephen on this, but I think, as we think about the full risks that we are facing, we need to recognize as we collect data that we owe some measure of stewardship to those that give us the data.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Steve, back to you.
Sure. In terms of some information, I mean, some of the most useful information that we will get in terms of treatments will be from long-term studies. And so this long-term studies will necessitate the collection of data, because as we introduce new therapies into the marketplace, we'll need the long-term studies to really evaluate their effectiveness and the long-term safety. So that's going to be an important part of the research. And some of these programs have tracked this in the past, some of the heart studies and the current study with all of us. So we're trying to sort of use this in a manner, but we're very conscious, we're very careful about the ethics involved, the need for personal privacy. So that's part and parcel of this work. We're really trying to balance sort of the aspect of safety and benefit long term with sort of the issues relating to personal privacy, because we value the patient care as much as we value the scientific discoveries. So we have to balance those two issues.
And in today's world, Steve, there's this speed to market challenge as well. And I'm just wondering, who are the players, who are the people at the table as you're trying to work through some of these questions of balancing privacy, speed to market, collaborations with companies like Janssen Pharmaceuticals? Who participates in that kind of decision-making and framework?
Well, one aspect, of course, for us is to try to accelerate the collaboration itself in terms of making sure that we can focus on the science, can focus on the healthcare, rather than necessarily focus on always on administrative issues. So some of these have been some novel partnerships, particularly with the NIH Foundation, that's put together a number of different collaborations with multiple companies to sort of work on pre-competitive areas, foundations that are basically needed for all the scientific work to follow. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that NIH is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. Our sister agency is the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. So clearly the FDA's role in these types of issues is very important. And we work very closely with our colleagues at the FDA to make sure that as projects go through, that they meet the regulatory requirements, the safety requirements that are very important. That's a fundamental issue for the FDA, and it's certainly a challenging issue, but it's one that's very important for us and very important for them to consider going forward. So, and some of this, will come out in the long run, but in terms of as we get more and more data about different types of therapies, different types of approaches. But the other approach that we try to do in terms of minimizing risk in these areas is we don't just lock down on one particular approach. So our funding mechanisms, our collaborations will take a number of different approaches to a particular area of illness or a particular area of care. So try to come up with different approaches and sort of manage the risk that way by having different approaches that can go through the development pipeline. Some may turn out better than others. Some may be approved by the FDA. Some may fail in development. But that way you're able to come up with something at the end of the day, and you've examined quite a number of different areas that could be potentially useful. And by having those different approaches, you spend more money perhaps on initial development, but you are able to come up with something that's actually best for patient care in the long run.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And you're talking a lot about partnerships with people, and that brings us to supply chain risk, which includes not just physical, tangible assets, but also people assets. And Heather, I know at Johnson & Johnson and certainly at Janssen Pharmaceuticals, supply chain risk can be disruptive in your processes. Tell us a little bit about how J&J and Janssen in particular is addressing supply chain risk. How are you thinking about that today?
Well, I think a lot of companies are probably thinking about whether they have multiple sources for their raw materials or in production needs. Having a single source comes with a lot of risk, right? So it goes back to that risk management. So, it's definitely important to, in this day and age now, having seen that a global pandemic can literally cut supply chains or risk the supply chain for numerous areas, consumer goods versus other goods. I definitely think it's going to take sort of like a lessons learned once we get through this to say, hey, do we need to take a different approach on how the supply chain works, right? And making sure that we're prepared for any other things that might come along its way. I definitely think that's in a lot of different industries, they're going to be looking at that. Because if you had a single source that was in another country and now borders are shut down and flights are shut down and all of those kind of things, well, how are you going to source that material now? So I definitely know that it's something that's on everybody's mind, and maybe now it's just get us through, but I think there'll definitely be some lessons learned on how not to have single sources and maybe have multiple sources. So if something's disrupted, at least they can continue their end-to-end supply chain. So.
Over the last few years, we've seen some movement of supply chain and third party move from the typical procurement area over into the operational risk department. And I'm just wondering, Elizabeth, as a chief risk officer, how do you see supply chain risk? Do you see it as a procurement function, or do you see it as an operational risk management function?
Well, there's certainly a relationship there as one flows into the other in terms of a process. I think we talked about connectivity earlier on. There's clearly connectivity there, whether it's being from a procurement and making sure that we can acquire these supplies, or to maybe an operational area where the supplies are actually being used, where possibly planning is occurring and being able to stay ahead of demand. And that's where those estimates are being developed. So an integration, I think, is what I would see to be more optimal. An integration, a consideration of the dependencies of both, being able to manage and stay ahead of demand.
Steve, any additional comments from you on supply chain?
Yeah. I could add something to that. I mean, one of the focus from the research enterprise perspective is that we've always struggled a little bit with access to materials for conduct research and eventually move that research into sort of clinical studies. So one of the responses has been to set up various repositories. This could be for research materials or other types of materials used in sort of testing or screening of new compounds. So the whole idea is to set up a bit of an infrastructure. It's not, at the end of the day, maybe the most sexy and demanding part of the overall scientific enterprise, but it's kind of a fundamental basis for a lot of the work that we do. And you never know when you might need a particular sample for some rare indication or some emerging disease. So to have materials and capabilities in reserve, I think, is very important, not only as a fundamental basis of ongoing research, but a method of sort of preparedness. So when the next challenge, the next scientific work that needs to be done, that perhaps you don't really know what that's going to be necessarily today, but to have the resources in place and the capabilities to move quickly, to pivot research and be able to handle new challenges that might come up in both the scientific and medical area. So that's been kind of a focus for us, both in physical repositories and also in the policy area, to promote sort of sharing of materials through our research tool sharing plans and agreements that we have with our collaborators.
Thank you. And just the last quick question I have is if you could give me a sense of how your culture in your company has helped shape some of your actions during this last 3 months. And Heather, just a one sentence response if you could.
We have a credo that's 75 years old, and our comment lately has been, we were built for times like this. So we will be able to lean in and support the future. So power of science, scale, stability of the company, and courage that we have as well. So we were built for times like this at Johnson & Johnson.
Great. And Elizabeth, one sentence on your culture and how it's helping you?
Of course, for us, we say safety is our first priority, and this priority we align ourselves to. So I think it's been great thinking through that as we find ourselves very prepared to respond to this pandemic.
Thanks. Steve?
So health is in our name, so obviously that's a focus. And we have our origin back to the 1880s. The founding of the NIH was based upon responding to infectious disease coming into New York Harbor based upon our laboratory in Staten Island. So this is kind of a fundamental core value for us.
Great. Thank you so much, panelists. And at MetricStream, it's about performing with integrity. And all three of you have certainly shared outstanding direction and leadership as you are on the front line and performing with integrity. Thank you so much to a great panel today. Thank you.